The first janissary to reach the top of the ladder had his throat torn open before he could plant his feet. His body plunged onto the comrades climbing below, knocking 3 of them into the void. Behind them, others were already scaling, always others. An endless tide of white turbans climbing the cracked walls while arrows sliced through the air and stones crushed skulls. Fire. Everywhere. Fire. The flames devoured the wooden ladders, but the Ottomans kept climbing through the inferno. Women poured boiling water from the battlements. Children dragged baskets of stones to the defenders. A Croatian peasant, his face covered in other men's blood, struck with a sickle at anything that appeared above the wall. Beside him, a knight without armor pushed bodies aside to make room for the next blows. 17, 18, 19 assaults. The Ottoman drums never stopped. Never. 100,000 throats roared from the other side of the walls, while bronze cannons vomited fire against the towers still standing. An explosion tore open a breach in the northern wall. Turkish soldiers poured through the gap like water breaking through a dam, and inside, waiting for them, 800 men who should have been dead weeks ago raised their weapons one final time. 25 days. 25 days of blood, gunpowder, and despair. And when the smoke finally cleared over the valley, when the drums at last fell silent and the greatest army on earth began its long march back home, a small fortress that no one considered important was still standing. Güns had not fallen, and Vienna, the jewel of Christendom, would never see the Sultan's tents in its fields. This is the story of how 800 Croatians without cannons stopped 120,000 Ottoman soldiers. The story of the siege that saved Europe. To understand the weight of those 25 days of August, one must first understand the world that existed before them. In the first half of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was not merely a military power. It was a force of nature. Since Mehmed II had conquered Constantinople in 1453, the sultans had expanded their domains with a speed that seemed to defy geography itself. From Egypt to Persia, from North Africa to the Balkans, the Green Crescent flew over lands that once belonged to a dozen different kingdoms. And on the throne of Istanbul sat the most formidable of all sultans, Suleiman I, called by Europeans the Magnificent, and by his own people, Kanuni, the lawgiver. At 38 years old, he had already conquered Belgrade and the island of Rhodes. He had crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the catastrophic Battle of Mohacs, where King Louis II himself drowned while fleeing. He had marched to the gates of Vienna in 1529, and although that first siege had failed due to bad weather and overstretched supply lines, the Sultan had not forgotten. Vienna remained an open wound in his imperial pride. On the other side of the border, Christian Europe bled from internal divisions. The Holy Roman Empire, ruled by Emperor Charles V, faced the simultaneous threat of the Protestant Reformation and French ambitions. His brother Ferdinand I, Archduke of Austria, claimed the Hungarian throne, but controlled only a fraction of the territory. The rest belonged to John Zapolya, a nobleman who had agreed to become Suleiman's vassal in exchange for Ottoman protection. Christendom was fragmented, and the Sultan knew it. In 1530, Ferdinand launched a counter-offensive, reconquering fortresses along the Danube and challenging Ottoman dominance over Hungary. It was an act of defiance that Suleiman could not ignore. The response came 2 years later in the form of the Fifth Imperial Campaign, the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled for a westward march. The numbers varied depending on the chronicler, but all estimates agreed on one thing. It was an overwhelming force. 120,000 soldiers, according to the most conservative calculations. Some spoke of 200,000. Among them marched the dreaded Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, recruited as children from Christian families in the Balkans and trained from infancy to be the deadliest war machines in the world. Alongside them rode the Sipahis, The Ottoman heavy cavalry, whose lances had pierced the formations of a dozen European armies. There were archers from Anatolia, Persian siege engineers, Tatar horsemen from Crimea, sappers specialized in mines and tunnels. And behind all of this, an immense caravan of supplies, bronze cannons, camels, silk tents, and the Sultan's entire court on the move. The objective was clear. March on Vienna, capture the Habsburg capital, and open the road to the conquest of Central Europe. If the city fell, nothing would remain between the Ottomans and the German lands. The dream of a universal caliphate, encompassing both East and West, seemed within Suleiman's grasp. In May of 1532, the army departed from Istanbul. It crossed the Balkans in endless columns, leaving behind a trail of dust that could be seen for miles. In July, it crossed the Drava River at Osijek and entered the Hungarian territory controlled by Ferdinand. The fortresses along the way fell one after another, some after brief sieges, many without even offering resistance. The commanders knew that facing such a force was suicide. Better to open the gates and hope for the Sultan's mercy. 17 castles surrendered before the Ottoman army caught sight of the walls of Güns. 17 fortresses that should have delayed the advance, protected the border, bought time for reinforcements to arrive. 17 failures. And meanwhile, in Regensburg, too far away to make any difference, Emperor Charles V was still trying to gather his scattered forces. Ferdinand I, Archduke of Austria, knew he could not face Suleiman in open battle. His troops were few, poorly equipped, spread across a border far too long to defend. He did the only thing he could. He retreated, taking the bulk of his army with him, abandoning the smaller fortresses to their fate. Among the garrisons left behind was one in particular, so small and insignificant that no one expected it to make any difference. Güns. The fortress lay just a few miles from the Austrian border, south of the city of Sopron. Its walls were ancient, built in an era before the great siege cannons. Its towers were low, its moats were shallow. There was no strategic position of great importance, no river to block the advance, no mountain to offer defensive advantage. It was just a small fortified town in the middle of rolling plains, surrounded by fields and forests. And it was all that remained between Suleiman and Vienna. The man tasked with defending it was a Croatian nobleman of 42 years named Nikola Jurišić. Born in the coastal city of Senj, in Croatia, he had spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans. Since 1522, he had served as an officer in the Habsburg border fortresses, learning firsthand the tactics of defense against an enemy he knew better than most European generals. After the Battle of Mohacs, Ferdinand had appointed him supreme commander of the border forces, recognizing in him a rare combination of courage, experience, and diplomatic ability. Jurišić knew the Ottomans. He had visited Constantinople twice as an envoy, negotiating peace treaties and studying the workings of the enemy empire up close. He spoke Turkish. He understood their tactics. And he knew, better than anyone, that the force approaching was invincible in open battle. But he also knew something else, that walls, however fragile, could buy time. And time was the only currency Christendom possessed at that moment. When he received the order to defend Güns, Jurišić did not protest. He did not ask for reinforcements he knew would not come. He did not demand cannons that did not exist. He simply gathered the men he had, approximately 750 Croatian soldiers, most of them veterans of the border wars, accustomed to fighting at a numerical disadvantage. There were also 46 professional knights, a handful of German citizens from the town, and about 700 peasants armed with whatever they could find. Sickles, wood-cutting axes, clubs, kitchen knives tied to sticks, in total fewer than 1,500 combatants. Women, children, and the elderly brought the total population to perhaps 4,000 souls, all of them trapped behind walls that shook at the slightest impact, and before them more than 120,000 enemies. Jurišić gave no grand speeches. He promised no victory. He walked among his men, looked each of them in the eye, and said only this: that every day they held the Ottomans was another day for Vienna to prepare, that every hour gained was an hour stolen from the Sultan, and that if they died there, they would die as free men defending their land. The soldiers understood. The peasants understood. Even the women and children understood. And on the night of August 4th, 1532, as the first Ottoman campfires began to dot the horizon like an ocean of fallen stars, the small garrison of Güns made its choice. They would stay. The first sign of the Ottoman army arrived before the army itself. Tatar horsemen appeared on the hills around the city, reconnaissance circles that tested the defenses and frightened anyone who thought of fleeing. Behind them came the scouts of Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, mapping the terrain, identifying the weak points in the walls, calculating where to position the artillery. Ibrahim Pasha was, after the Sultan himself, the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. A Greek by birth, captured as a boy and raised as a slave in the imperial palace, he had risen through a combination of brilliant intelligence, personal charm, and an intimate friendship with Suleiman dating back to both their youths. As Grand Vizier, he commanded armies in the Sultan's name, negotiated treaties with emperors and kings, and executed his master's will with ruthless efficiency. On August 5th, the Ottoman vanguard completely surrounded the city. The gates were closed. The last families trying to flee were captured or killed. The trap was sealed. Ibrahim Pasha did not know how poorly defended Güns was. The intelligence reports were vague, and the 17 fortresses that had surrendered before created an expectation of minimal resistance. He assumed the city had a reasonable garrison, perhaps several thousand men, and planned the siege accordingly. Had he known the truth, he might have ordered an immediate assault and massacred the garrison in a matter of hours. But he did not know, and that mistake would cost him precious weeks. The siege began on August 6th with a roar that made the earth tremble. The Ottoman cannons opened fire at dawn, dozens of them positioned in a semicircle on the hills around the city, vomiting iron and stone against the ancient walls. The sound was deafening. Each impact shook the ground, brought dust down from the ceilings, cracked stones that had stood for centuries. Towers collapsed in cascades of rubble. Entire sections of wall trembled, tilted, threatened to fall. The defenders crouched behind the battlements, praying between the blasts, counting the seconds between one explosion and the next. There was no way to respond. Jurišić did not have a single cannon. His few muskets were useless against targets hundreds of yards away. All he could do was wait, conserve strength, and prepare for the moment when the Ottomans would try to scale the walls. That moment came on August 10th. Suleiman arrived at the camp that morning, mounted on a black horse, surrounded by his personal guard. The war drums sounded across the plains. The Sultan's standards were raised before his green silk tent. And the order was given: take the fortress. The first assault came at noon, under a scorching sun that turned armor into ovens. Waves of janissaries advanced across the open field, carrying wooden ladders above their heads, shields raised against the arrows that began to fall. Behind them, archers fired in arcs, trying to keep the defenders pinned down while the climbers approached. Jurišić had distributed his men along the entire length of the walls. Each section had a commander. Each commander had specific orders. Do not waste ammunition. Do not expose yourself unnecessarily. Wait until the attackers are close enough not to miss. The janissaries reached the base of the walls. The ladders struck against the cracked stone. And then hell began. The defenders rose like demons emerging from the earth. Arrows fired at point-blank range pierced throats and eyes. Stones the size of human heads rained down on the climbers, breaking shoulders. crushing hands that tried to grip the rungs. Boiling water poured from the battlements, tearing screams from men whose faces dissolved under the scalding liquid. The first janissary to reach the top of the ladder found Jurišić waiting for him. The Croatian captain struck once, twice, 3 times. The Turk's body plunged back onto his companions. Another climbed immediately behind, and he too fell. And another, and another. Along the entire length of the walls, the same scene repeated. Men climbed, men died. Ladders were pushed back, sending dozens of climbers tumbling at once. Other ladders took their place. The janissaries did not retreat. They did not know how to retreat. They had been trained since childhood to advance until victory or until death. But the Croatians did not retreat either. Peasants without armor fought shoulder to shoulder alongside professional knights. Women ran behind the lines carrying arrows, stones, buckets of water for the thirsty. An old woman with white hair struck a janissary with an iron pan when he managed to cross the wall, beating his head until he stopped moving. A boy of perhaps 12 years reloaded crossbows with trembling fingers while his father fired one after another. The first assault lasted 3 hours. When the drums finally sounded the retreat, hundreds of Ottoman bodies lay piled at the base of the walls. The ground was soaked with blood, the air stank of burned flesh and exposed entrails. But the defenders had also paid their price. Dozens dead, as many more wounded, and everyone knew that this had been only the first of many assaults. The night brought a tense silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the hammering of Ottoman carpenters building new ladders. The defenders slept in shifts, armor on, weapons within reach. Jurišić walked among them, checking wounds, distributing the few rations that remained, murmuring words of encouragement to men who already looked like ghosts. At dawn, the cannons began again. The following days brought more of the same, in a brutal repetition that seemed to have no end. Assaults in the morning, bombardment in the afternoon, scaling attempts at dusk. Each attack was repelled, but each attack also took its toll. On the 5th day, a cannonball struck the southeast tower while 20 men defended it. The structure collapsed like a house of cards, burying everyone under tons of stone. The survivors heard the muffled screams of those still alive, trapped beneath the rubble. There was no time to rescue them. Another assault was already coming. On the 7th day, the Ottomans tried a different tactic. They sent archers with fire arrows, targeting the wooden roofs inside the city. Fires erupted in a dozen places simultaneously. While the defenders ran to extinguish the flames, the janissaries scaled a less protected section of the northern wall. It was the first time Ottomans managed to gain a foothold atop the walls. Jurišić was on the other side of the city when he heard the screams. He ran through the narrow streets, sword in hand, gathering men along the way. When he reached the northern wall, he found a dozen janissaries fighting fiercely against twice as many defenders. Bodies from both sides covered the stones. Blood ran through the cracks, dripping onto the street below. The Croatian captain entered the fight without hesitation. His sword was a blur of steel, cutting, parrying, striking. Beside him, a massive blacksmith wielded a war hammer, breaking bones with every blow. An Orthodox priest brandished a wooden cross as if it were a mace, beating any Turk who came near. The fight on the northern wall lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the last janissary fell, the defenders were so exhausted they could barely stand. Jurišić looked at the bodies of the enemies, then at his own men, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. That night, the Ottomans changed tactics again. If they could not go over the walls, they would go under. The sappers began to dig. Jurišić realized what was happening before it was too late. The sounds were unmistakable to anyone who knew siege warfare. The rhythmic striking of picks, the creak of wood being used to shore up tunnels, the muffled murmur of voices coming from somewhere beneath the earth. He ordered countermines. His few engineers, aided by peasants accustomed to digging wells, began excavating tunnels of their own. trying to intercept the Ottoman ones before they reached the foundations. What followed was an invisible war, fought in total darkness, in spaces so cramped that men could barely move. When the tunnels met, the fighting was primitive, brutal, devoid of any honor or strategy. Knives replaced swords, bare hands strangled throats, men bit, scratched, blinded each other in the absolute darkness. Some tunnels collapsed during the fights, burying combatants from both sides alive. Others were flooded when the defenders managed to divert water into the galleries, drowning the Ottoman sappers like rats in a trap. The smell of wet earth and decomposing flesh rose from underground, mixing with the smoke of fires on the surface. On August 15th, the Ottomans managed to position their first gunpowder charge. The explosion woke the entire city. A section of the northern wall simply disappeared, replaced by a smoking crater and a breach 30 feet wide. Stones flew in every direction. Nearby houses collapsed. Men were hurled through the air like ragdolls. The Janissaries advanced before the dust settled. This time, there were not hundreds, there were thousands. A human wave pouring through the breach, screaming the name of Allah, swords and scimitars gleaming under the morning sun. The sound of their footsteps was like an earthquake. The glare of their armor was blinding, but Jurišić had prepared. During the nights, while the sappers dug, his men had built a second line of defense. A barricade of wood, stone, furniture, overturned carts, anything that could serve as an obstacle. It was positioned exactly behind the most vulnerable section of the wall, as if the Croatian captain had guessed where the explosion would come. The Janissaries entered through the breach and found not an open city, but another improvised fortress waiting for them. The fight at the breach was the bloodiest moment of the siege. The Ottomans had overwhelming numbers, but the opening was too narrow to use them. The defenders, fighting shoulder to shoulder behind the barricade, turned every yard into a slaughterhouse. Spears pierced chests, axes split skulls. Men fought until their weapons broke, then fought with bare hands, with stones, with their own teeth. Jurišić stood at the center of the line, his armor covered in blood, his face a mask of frozen determination. He had stopped counting how many enemies he had killed. He had stopped thinking about anything beyond the next blow, the next enemy, the next second of survival. Around him, men fell, friends he had fought alongside for decades, peasants whose names he had never known, women who had taken up arms when their husbands died, all mixed together in the same cauldron of blood and steel. An Ottoman scimitar cut into his left shoulder. He felt the impact, felt the warm blood running beneath his armor, but he did not stop. He could not stop. If he stopped, the line would break. If the line broke, everyone would die. The assault lasted hours. Hours of screaming, of metal against metal, of men dying by the score. When the drums finally sounded the retreat and the Janissaries fell back through the breach, the defenders were so exhausted that many simply collapsed where they stood, unable to take another step. The barricade had become so soaked with blood that it was slippery. Ottoman bodies formed piles so high they partially blocked the breach itself. The smell was unbearable. The silence that followed the roar of battle felt like an insult. But Güns was still standing. The days dragged on like wounds that would not heal. The August sun punished besiegers and besieged alike, but it was the Ottomans who suffered more. Their army was too large for the region, the supplies they had brought were running out, the fodder for the horses was gone, and the animals were beginning to starve. Drinking water was becoming scarce, and in the cramped trenches where soldiers waited for the next order to attack, diseases were beginning to spread. Dysentery, fever, infections that turned small wounds into death sentences. The Ottoman doctors worked without rest, but for every man they saved, 10 more fell ill. The camp was beginning to stink like a slaughterhouse, and it was not just from the blood of combat. Suleiman watched it all from his silk tent, his face a mask of controlled frustration. He had expected Güns to fall in a matter of days. Every fortress along the way had surrendered almost without a fight. Why did this insignificant little town resist? Why did those few miserable Croatians not understand that they faced the greatest army in the world? The Janissaries began to murmur, first in whispers, then in increasingly loud voices. They were the elite, the chosen, the invincible, and they were being humiliated by peasants armed with sickles. Some demanded that the Sultan order a final assault with all available force, whatever the cost. Others simply wanted to abandon this cursed place and continue toward Vienna. But Suleiman knew what his generals also knew. The August rains were coming. In a few days, the roads would turn into impassable quagmires. The heavy cannons, already difficult to move, would become stuck. And meanwhile, reports from scouts indicated that Charles V had finally assembled his army in Vienna. 80,000 men, they said, perhaps more. Fresh, well-supplied, waiting behind walls far stronger than those of Güns. The arithmetic was cruel but inescapable. Even if they took Güns tomorrow, there would not be enough time to reach Vienna and conquer it before winter, because of 800 men who did not know when to stop fighting. Inside the walls, Jurišić was also calculating. His men were at their limit. More than half of the original defenders were dead or too gravely wounded to continue fighting. Ammunition had practically run out. Food was rationed to the point of starvation. There were no more stones to throw, no more oil to boil, no more arrows to fire. After the 19th assault, Jurišić gathered his surviving officers. There were only 7 of them, all wounded, all with the hollow stare of men who had seen too much. He did not need to say anything. They all knew. If the Ottomans came with everything tomorrow, it would be the end. It was then that the messenger arrived. Ibrahim Pasha sent an envoy under a white flag, offering terms. The proposal was surprisingly generous. If Jurišić opened the gates and allowed a small Ottoman force to raise the Sultan's standard over the walls, a symbolic formality that would allow Suleiman to declare victory, the garrison would be spared. No massacre, no slavery. The defenders could depart in peace, taking their weapons and their honor with them. Jurišić listened to the proposal in silence. His wounded arm throbbed beneath the blood-soaked bandages. His eyes burned with exhaustion. For 25 days, he had held back the greatest army in the world with fewer than 1,000 men. He had done the impossible. Historical sources differ on what happened next. Some chroniclers claim that Jurišić rejected the offer and the Ottomans simply withdrew in the face of his intransigence. Others say he accepted the terms of the symbolic surrender, allowing a small group of Ottomans to enter only to raise their flag before departing. The truth perhaps lies somewhere between the two versions. What is certain is this. On August 28th, 1532, the Ottoman drums sounded one final time. It was not the roll of attack. It was the beat of retreat. The tents began to be dismantled. The cannons were loaded onto transport carts. The endless columns that had arrived nearly a month before began to form again, this time pointing south. Jurišić watched from atop the ruined walls. His eyes were sunken with exhaustion, his armor stained with the blood of 25 days of continuous combat. Around him, the survivors watched in silence as the ocean of enemies began to drain away toward the horizon. No one celebrated. There was no strength for that. Some men simply sat where they were and closed their eyes. Others wept in silence, tears running down faces covered in soot and dried blood. The women who had carried stones and water began to search for their husbands and sons among the wounded and the dead. The small fortress of Güns had survived. The Ottomans did not march directly back home. Suleiman, furious at the time lost, ordered his army to devastate the Austrian territories around them as they retreated. Villages were burned, crops destroyed. Thousands of prisoners were captured and taken as slaves. It was the revenge of a humiliated sultan a demonstration that even in defeat his power was absolute. But Vienna remained untouched. When Charles V finally arrived at the city on September 23rd with his imperial army, he found only news of the Ottoman retreat. The great battle everyone expected never happened. The decisive confrontation between the two greatest empires in the world was postponed for another generation, and all because of Güns. News of the defense spread across Europe with the speed of fire through dry straw. In Rome, the Pope celebrated masses of thanksgiving. In Vienna, Ferdinand I declared Jurišić a hero of Christendom. In every court in Europe, diplomats and generals discussed how it was possible that fewer than 1,000 men had stopped 120,000. For Jurišić, the reward was more modest, but equally significant. Ferdinand named him a Baron of the Holy Roman Empire, a rare honor for a Croatian nobleman. Later, he would be made Supreme Commander of the border forces of Slavonia and Lower Austria, recognized as the man who best knew Ottoman tactics and how to counter them. He would spend the rest of his life defending the borders, always prepared for the next attack he knew would come. In 1543, 11 years after the siege, Nikola Jurišić died in Kőszeg, in the same city he had defended. They say he asked to be buried in the shadow of the walls his men had held against the impossible. As for the Ottomans, the failure at Güns marked the end of their westward expansion. Suleiman would live another 34 years, would conquer Baghdad and much of Persia, would turn the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake, but he would never again attempt to take Vienna. The memory of those 25 days of August would remain as a silent warning that even the greatest army in the world had its limits. In Kőszeg, the memory of the siege never faded. To this day, the city's bells ring every day at 11 in the morning, marking the moment when, according to tradition, the Ottomans finally abandoned the siege. It is a sound that echoes through the centuries, a daily reminder that once, in a distant summer, a handful of men and women decided they would not retreat. There are lessons in this that transcend the centuries, that brute force does not always prevail, that human will can overcome mathematical odds, that sometimes, at crucial moments in history, the course of events is altered not by great armies or brilliant generals, but by ordinary people who refuse to yield. The walls of Güns no longer exist as they were. The city grew, changed, modernized. The castle where Jurišić commanded the defense was rebuilt and today houses a museum. Tourists walk through its halls, look at the old portraits, read the explanatory plaques, and try to imagine what it was like to live through those days of fire and blood. But if you go there on a summer morning, when the sun strikes the ancient stones and the wind blows from the Hungarian plains, you can still feel something. A presence, a memory, the echo of voices that refuse to be silenced. At 11 o'clock, the bells will ring, as they have rung every day for nearly 500 years, the victory of those few over so many. The day Europe was saved by 800 men who had nothing but courage. The Siege of Güns,